What's up everyone, my name is Sparkles McGlitterbuns, aka Bane, and I'm here to help with your "oh no, can't believe my story isn't ready for NaNoWriMo 2017 jitters." Woo! By the time you see this, there will only be a couple days left before National Novel Writing Month starts, if that. More likely it's already November, so you're probably stressing out thinking maybe it's too late, so first things first, don't panic. The way I'm going to be laying this out will build in an extra 4 days as a buffer, so even if it's November 3rd or 4th and you're tearing out your hair thinking that maybe you missed it, don't worry. We're gonna get you back on track. So 3 quick things to start off with. First, I'm gonna be using my own NaNoWriMo 2017 story as an example, so get ready for things to get all spoilerific up in here. This isn't the only way of writing stories, but I've used this method to write 3 completed novels, not to mention more than 70 short and feature screenplays, so you can be reasonably sure it works. Second, if you're interested in checking out my 5-minute Moana video, you get to see this narrative structure in practice in an actual story. It's a lot of fun, plus I talk really fast, plus Moana, so win, win, win. And third, I'm including a link in the description to a PDF version of the story building template that I use, including a fillable form on the second page, so you can just lay out your story in each of the little fields and you'll be ready to go. When you get right down to it, stories are about a protagonist's journey towards overcoming their fatal flaw or quality or characteristic that's drawing them off track and pushing them towards death, and replacing that flaw with a noble virtue. That is, a quality or characteristic that helps both them and their home community in terms of survival. Every story involves 3 major movements of change, driven by the transition from the protagonist's pursuit of their false goal, the thing that they think they want but isn't really going to help them, to their true goal, which is the thing that the protagonist actually needs in order to get their lives back on track. So essentially, beginning, middle, and end. Shocking, right? 30 days isn't a lot of time to write a novel, even one that's only 50,000 words long, as opposed to the typical, maybe 70 to 100,000 words of a mainstream novel. And once you're off and rolling, you can easily get confused about what it is you're even trying to say. The spontaneousness in your story is going to come from the characters' dialogue and interactions, but if you don't know where you're going with them when you start out the door, so to speak, you're probably going to get lost in the woods along the way, go off track, and you might even stop writing. But we're not going to let that happen, gremlins, are we? Alright, let's get started! The protagonist for my NaNoWriMo story, STORM BOI, which is a young adult urban fantasy story, is Ben Hartley, a 17-year-old trans man living in an unnamed middle American town. Now, being as how I'm not myself trans, obviously this warrants some special considerations in terms of creating Ben's character, but I feel very strongly about making him trans to begin with. Having been bullied about my own sexuality and gender identity when I was younger, this is actually something that's incredibly close to my heart. There are so many cisgendered protagonists out there in literature, and I think queer and trans folks should have more of an opportunity to see ourselves reflected in lead characters. Now, while I don't have quite that same level of lived experience to rely on, I've been going well out of my way to listen to trans voices, see how people feel about protagonists that they do see, what they don't want to see, and obviously no 2 people are ever completely alike, so no 2 trans people would be completely alike. I'm going to use the analogy of sci-fi and fantasy, which are kind of my writing wheelhouse, to explain what my approach is going to be. A sci-fi or fantasy story is never about the cool gadget or the shiny crystals. Those things inform the story, but they don't define it, because otherwise that would be lazy storytelling. My protagonist, Ben's, experiences with transitioning will similarly inform who he is, but as far as the story itself goes, this is going to be about Ben falling in love with new student Mina, and how the 2 of them overcome obstacles together and ultimately face a tremendous sacrifice. Ben's fatal flaw is going to be anger, and we're going to see that directed at 2 people in particular. First and foremost is his school antagonist, Danny, a privileged bully who makes life miserable for anyone who's not one of his clique of popular kids, and a few that are. Danny's friends and most of the teachers like him because of his money, so he's allowed to get off the hook with a lot of stuff. And after Ben and Danny get into a fistfight a few years ago, Danny, again, gets let off the hook, while Ben got labeled as a troublemaker. Ben's anger is the result of this frustration. His problem isn't even necessarily Danny himself, although, Danny is emotionally and verbally abusive to friends and enemies, but Ben obsessing over the unfairness of the situation, while completely understandable, is even more toxic. He can't see past this one bully. And let's be honest, don't we all know a Danny? The kind of person who's incredibly ungrateful and cruel to everybody around them, but they have enough money or the right family and no one cares. So that's our first bully, and one's bad enough, but let's pile on another one, Mina's grandfather, who bullies her in the same way that Danny picks on Ben. Gramps is hyper-religious, conservative, and utterly opposed to Mina expanding her magical abilities or even possessing them in the first place. Mina's story is basically that of matriarchy versus patriarchy. Magic runs through the women in her family group, but intercessory father types have had a stranglehold hold over them for years. So back to Ben. From the perspective of the story core, we could write him to be trans or cisgendered. It wouldn't really matter. We could support it either way. But again, my point in making him trans is because we need to signal boost stories that are not starring male, white, cisgendered, heterosexual protagonists. We've got plenty of those male gaze type of characters in modern literature. Now it's time to look elsewhere and provide some different perspectives. So whether it's Danny, Mina's grandfather, or some other bully to come along, Ben's anger is going to end up getting him into trouble. It's eating him up from the inside, and he has to figure out how to cope with it. Because the wretched, awful truth is that sometimes life is massively unfair and massively cruel. We all try to make the world a better place, but we still have to live in it in the meantime and figure out how to deal with that ugliness. Ben's noble virtue, then, is going to be the ability to see the bigger picture, trading out his hatred for Danny for his love for Mina, because sometimes that kind of perspective is what really does make the difference. It can sound anticlimactic because it's such an internal change, but we're going to use elemental magic to externalize the conflict and make it feel really visceral. Ultimately, like any healthy relationship, Ben and Mina are going to save each other. Revenge feels good in the moment, but it's ultimately destructive. So in learning to be more altruistic and loving, Ben will end up saving himself too, just as much as he's saving Mina. He's been hurt by the world. Badly, and he deserves the true all-encompassing love that can make life's injustices just that little bit easier to bear. So these are the core elements that form the story engine of Storm Boy. We have our protagonist, Ben Hartley, his fatal flaw, which is his anger, that negative focus, his noble virtue, which is love, positive focus. His false goal is to get revenge on Danny, but in truth, he really needs to help Mina become the magician or spellcaster that she's meant to be, free of her family's restrictions. We even know that in this case, the magical world, or the place where the protagonist starts to replace their fatal flaw with the noble virtue and get that new better perspective, isn't going to be physical like the arena in the Hunger Games or everything outside of the Shire in the Lord of the Rings. Instead, this magical world is going to be one of experience. Ben's homeworld is the same as our own, mundane, completely non-magical. In getting to know Mina, he's exposed to the world of elemental magic that's existed under his nose the entire time, but just invisible for those not prepared to see it. That isn't a unique trope, but honestly, I don't need it to be because this is a modern fairy tale. Cool, huh? Now we can run through the tentpoles or major story moments that make for the narrative core of Storm Boy. The hook, or the first beat, is the introduction to a story. It essentially hooks the audience in from their own homeworld. In Storm Boy, Ben helps his dead grandmother's friend prepare for a big storm that's about to hit their trailer park, and this woman is rumored to be strange in town, but Ben knows otherwise. Like, she cheats at mahjong, but that's basically it. She's pretty harmless. And here in the hook, we also see Mina arrive at her new home, which is her grandfather's house, on the edge of the trailer park, and there's something different about her. Ben can't quite put his finger on it, but the hairs on the nape of his neck stand on end as they, their eyes meet for the first time or something like that. So he gets the idea that something is a little bit different here. Next comes the homeworld. So essentially we see the protagonist in their home zone, which we can see that they've essentially outgrown. Ben's homeworld is him at school trying to steer clear of Danny, kind of hating him from a distance, keeping him at arm's length. Danny is a cheat and a thief. We know this already. Everybody loves him. He makes Ben's life miserable, but Ben is essentially powerless to stop him because, again, with that troublemaker label on his back, he really doesn't have a leg to stand on. It's unfair, and he has to cope with it, but he's not doing so well at the moment. Mina arrives at school as the new girl and automatically attracts Danny's attention, but we don't necessarily know how at first. Is he gonna like her? Is he gonna hate her? Either way, something about this interaction has Ben very set on edge. Next comes foreshadowing, or essentially a small crisis that involves the protagonist and hints at the story's central conflict, but doesn't quite get there yet. Ben's mom is concerned that he's getting into stuff with Danny at school again. She's got his back 100%, but at the same time, she doesn't want to see her son get hurt and get into any more trouble. She just wants to get him out of this small town and on with the rest of his life. Ben, on the other hand, really isn't open to moving because he does want to stay near the few friends he has. Again, completely understandable. At school again, Ben talks to his friends about the new girl, and he's really kind of overly concerned about him in that way that makes your friends be like, "Oh, really, huh? You're concerned, huh?" But he angrily reminds them of the kind of things that Danny's actually capable of. Now, the scar is probably something that, was in part accidental, but it doesn't matter. In the end, Ben got hurt. He goes out for a run that night and actually runs into Mina for the first time. So we get that little meet cute of their first interaction. Our fourth story beat is the inciting incident, where the protagonist smashes into a new character from the magical world who is going to lead them to the formation of their false goal. Ben is really doing his best to steer clear of Mina, especially after running into her, well, almost literally when he was out running. Instead, he grudgingly brings her under the protection of his social group after he sees Mina drawing some art. She's drawing an angel and, makes sure to give her breasts, and Danny makes fun of her for that. That is actually based on something that happened to me in 2nd grade, so Mina subtly causes some elemental magic to happen, like maybe that thunder rattles the school windows like a gunshot, something that startles everybody, breaks up that interaction, and Ben notices the odd coincidence, but doesn't really know how he can attribute it to Mina. It's weird. It's definitely something that makes him notice her a little bit more, but he still has no idea what's up. 5th up is the proto-magical world, or essentially the light version of the magical world, kind of like the shallow end of the swimming pool. During the proto-magical world, the protagonist encounters new people and forces. There are usually a couple little bit of tests, and it ultimately pushes them towards leaving. Now, I already know that I want to call my proto-magical chapter Sparks, and this is where Ben and Mina are going to be working on a project together after school. Again, we had them in science class, so we're going to have that bit of continuity here. And things go pretty well, and they're actually getting along really nicely until Mina makes some actual sparks when their hands touch, and she immediately takes off. But for Ben, this is when he sees that first concrete bit of evidence that says, yes, Mina is magical. There is something that's really special about this girl. Our final beat that caps off that first act in our story is when we break orbit. So it's the formation of the false goal, which the protagonist believes is going to fix whatever's wrong in their life, and the crossing of the threshold into the magical world in pursuit of the false goal. Now, this is a really important beat because once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. So whatever you've set up in the home world, that's it, we're moving on. In this case, Ben really has discovered Mina's secret and promises to keep it for her. After Danny bullies Mina, probably he steals a story that she's written for English class, reads it aloud, gets the credit in typical Danny fashion. Mina confronts him about it, but Danny threatens her both physically and with Daddy's lawyers, so there's really no recourse. What's worse is that she can't manifest her powers without risking her grandfather throwing her out. Or worse. He's not a great guy and she's definitely not living there with him by choice, but it's moderately better than being out on the street, especially when you're somebody in your mid-teens. Ben vows to destroy Danny no matter the cost, and wonders if maybe Mina can't teach him a thing or two about magic. At any rate, there's no turning back for Ben after this point. He has that secret and he's got to help her keep it, even though Mina's emotions are probably making it so that her powers are actually manifesting a little bit out of her control. So now that we've got our characters out of that first act homeworld and into the magical world of the second act, we run into the switchback, which is where the protagonist is pushed off course from what they want, and we get that training and tests kind of section happening. In our switchback for Storm Boy, Mina is going to show Ben the old training grounds that were used to hone magical abilities, but have now fallen into disuse. And this is going to be our way of explaining what exactly happened in the history of our family without necessarily having our characters sit down and info dump everything. This way we get some dynamic interaction, and we actually get to see some of this stuff being put into use. As they're there, Ben's grandmother's friend, the one who cheats at Mahjong, is going to show up, and Mina's going to have a panic attack, which is going to lead to her causing a visual projection that comes around and threatens to attack her. Grandma's pal knows what to do, and coaches Ben through calming Mina down by holding her hand, just that simple human connection. Here we also get the warning of what would happen to a human if they essentially got juiced up with magical abilities, and it's nothing good. And this isn't a societal law, this is a physical one. So for any reason Ben were to obtain those magical abilities that would help him crush Danny, he would probably die. It's got to be that level of severity in order for this to come around and bite things in the butt big time later on down the road. Next comes the midpoint, where the protagonist realizes what's really going on in a story and the stakes are raised. In Storm Boy, Ben and Mina are going to sneak out to the sand pits as this kind of like midnight date, and Mina's going to intentionally use her powers for the first time, feeling safe enough to do so now that she has Ben there beside her. For him, this is going to be a totally unique experience because he is kind of the knight in shining armor. So for him, that's a totally different role than Troublemaker, someone seeing him in a totally different light, and he starts to realize that he can be somebody else too, not just angry, but he can transmute that anger into strength. Mina's going to use her elemental magic to bring this sort of barren sand pit to life. Unfortunately, it's just in time for Danny and his pals to come and shoot up the place. They're drinking, they're underage, they're being huge pains, but ultimately, Ben is shocked by the fact that Mina feels bad for Danny. She's the first person to notice how truly codependent he is, and the fact that he's emotionally abusive because he cannot stand to be alone with himself. It's the first time that Ben's ever thought of Danny as being vulnerable, and for that, he's able to actually put him out of his mind for a few minutes and focus on himself. Ben gets Mina safely home, and they kiss for the first time. And Ben walks home with a head full of complicated emotions. Again, he's finally able to just take that little bit of a step away from his obsessive hatred for Danny and start thinking, how can I actually help somebody out? In this case, specifically Mina, as far as advancing her powers is concerned, because this is obviously something that's going to derail her life too. And since he cares about her, he wants to help. So after Ben starts hatching this plan to help Mina out and get her around her family so that she can learn to control her elemental magic, we come to the Chimera, or sort of a double-edged sword of story beats. This is where the protagonist seems on track to achieving their goal, but things are a little bit too perfect. The bottom is gonna drop out pretty shortly here. Ben acts as a go-between to help set up secret training lessons between his grandmother's old mahjong pal, who does have her own little coven, of course, of elemental wizards in the area, and Mina, using the old training grounds as far as the actual practice base goes, and using science class as a cover to her family. Things look kind of perfect for the first time in a while, and Ben realizes he's fallen in love with Mina, something he didn't necessarily think he was capable of. Again, he's been deeply hurt, and for him it's really surprising to realize that he has that ability to give unconditional love still inside of him. We're not going to dwell on this moment, but he will reveal to Mina here that he did used to have a different name, and out of respect for the character, I'm not going to use his dead name. I'm not even going to get into that. Not our purview. But he's going to mention it, and we realize Mina is an amazing person, thinks nothing of it, and we move right along. So it's acknowledged, but it doesn't become the centerpiece of the story. Ben's an interesting character, and I want him to have his time to shine. Of course, things do have to get worse before they get better, so we come to that final point in the end of Act 2, which is the beat of death. This is where the protagonist's fatal flaw causes the seeming ruin of their true goal, and their real or symbolic death is imminent. Because it really doesn't matter if the death is physical, emotional, that's up to us as the writer to kind of really support that conclusion and make it seem like, yes, this is really going to be awful. This death beat is really going to showcase some of the world's ugliness. Mina's family discover Ben and Mina innocently kissing, and of course Gramps is transphobic, so he's screaming Bible stuff at Ben, and Mina's grandfather is actually going to provoke Ben into hitting him by evoking some of these memories of his fight with Danny. He's still too close to this anger for the situation. If he had it at arm's length by now, this older man wouldn't be able to conjure up this vision, but it really is because Ben's hanging on to that anger so tightly that it ends up coming back against him. And right when Mina's grandfather is getting ready to hit him back, Mina herself intervenes, using the powers that she's been training up with Ben's help. This causes her family to grab onto her, and they're taking her to this old church across town for the exorcisation of her demonic powers, which are incredibly magical and amazing, but they just can't see it. Ben's grandmother's pal and her wizards are all that stop Ben from getting killed, but he has to stand idly by as Mina gets taken off to this evil church across the way. Act 3 kicks off with a resurrection, so a mentor rallies the protagonist for a final battle, reminds them that there's still time, gets them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. For Storm Boy, the resurrection happens when Mina is taken to this scary place. Everything starts going to hell in the town as her family essentially starts torturing her. The exorcism isn't going to be working due to the religious aspect, it's just going to be because there's this magical lodestone that was stored in the church area, which made everyone think that the church had magical powers, yada yada yada. But much like radiation, too much exposure to this magical stone is going to cause Mina to completely break down. And since she's no longer able to control these powers that she's just started learning how to use, a massive storm is going to overtake the town. It's going to be apocalyptic, earthquakes, hail, all that kind of stuff. Ben's grandmother's friends have their hands full trying to manage the situation, but ultimately somebody's got to go in there and help Mina. And that's gotta be Ben. So even though Ben knows that this is gonna mean sacrificing his life for Mina's, he goes to his grandmother's pal and begs her to do it. And she refuses twice, but on the third time says, okay, yes, you're essentially an adult, you understand your choices, go in there and save her. Our next to last story beat is the 0 hour. So the protagonist uses their noble virtue to save the day, often including themselves and their home world, and proves that the fatal flaw has been excised once and for all. So in our 0 hour, Ben's consciousness is amplified as he makes his way across town to the condemned church, and he runs into Danny along the way. This is really important because we need to see that he does understand love is way more powerful than anger. Yes, Danny has absolutely made his life a living hell, but Mina needs him more. She needs his love. She needs him to help save her. So even though there is a brief fight, Ben's only going to act in self-defense, and he's overhyped right now because he has all these magical abilities. So it's really a huge sign of how much he's grown that he's able to keep himself on track. Ben makes his way to the church and ultimately sacrifices himself to save Mina's life. But what he doesn't realize is that in so doing, he and Mina form a sort of a closed circuit. They save each other's lives. In terms of themes, I'll probably set up the very ancient Greek opposition of fire and water. Fire, of course, representing Ben's hot-headedness at the beginning of the story, and water representing that emotional placidity and tranquility that he's going to find by the end. In fact, Mina may be at risk of physically burning up at the end of the story, so this is where we get our title of Storm Boy. So Ben's going to have to actually end up bringing some kind of magical healing rain that will save Mina's life. So that's the narrative spine of my NaNoWriMo story. Now let's talk about pace. I know from personal experience that I tend to write chapters that are about 4,000 words long, and 4,000 words multiplied by 13 chapters equals about 52,000 words in total. So I can actually tell this story in its entirety by the end of November, still meeting that 50,000 word minimum for NaNoWriMo if I write at a pace of about 2,000 words a day. Now that's going to actually let me finish the book a little bit early, so about 4 days ahead of schedule, but alternately if something comes up along the way, or if I get sick, or if I have a day when I simply can't write for whatever reason, I'll have that little bit of flexibility in my schedule. Before I start writing though, I'm actually going to break this story down even further and lay out 4 story beats in each of these chapters with about 1,000 word target goal each. Honestly, once you write out all the details for each of these major tentpoles, you're gonna probably have a few consecutive thoughts all rolled up into one. So once you delve into that deeper level of detail, you might find that you have those beats there already. Think of it like a fractal. It looks one way from a certain distance, and then you zoom in and realize there's so much more detail there just waiting if you peer in close enough. So don't forget, if you haven't grabbed a copy of this story building PDF yet, it's free and can help you plot your NaNoWriMo story in a hurry. Plus, you can just type in your title here, blah blah blah, go through all these different fields, and then save it so you have it for reference later on. Here are a few more tips that might help you out as you're planning your literary voyage for the upcoming month. In terms of what program or medium to use whatever's comfortable for you. I end up using Google Docs because it's free and it auto-saves, and then I'll use either OpenOffice or Microsoft Word to do the actual formatting. As you're writing, you may find that there are points when your imagination kind of runs ahead of you and you can hear these little bits of dialogue bouncing off each other as the characters are sort of speaking in your head. And I often find it's worth it to just kind of take a minute and just write down some quick notes. Not even anything really fleshed out, but who says what in a line. I actually did that as I was writing my notes for this video too. I tend to put them on the next page to avoid distraction, but then it keeps them right there nice and handy, so once I write up to that point in the story, they're right there waiting for me. Try to think of writing like sculpting. It's going to be a little bit rough at first, and you're not trying to polish each little bit along the way. Your job right now is just to get it out on the page. Stories are so much easier to deal with once you already have something there. And even then, you're going to be making multiple passes or running through your story multiple times in order to put those bits of fine detail in. Give yourself permission to let it suck a little bit, because if you're a perfectionist, you're probably not going to get through this. A little bit of suckitude? Nah, future you can deal with that. Really consider including non-white, male, cishet characters. There are so many different types of people out there. We come in all shapes, colors, creeds, sizes, everything. Spread the love. Finishing NaNoWriMo is going to be about willpower, so you've got to clear away the distractions. While you're writing, make sure there's no social media going on, no TV, as few background distractions as possible, and if you do listen to music while you write, make sure that your playlists are set up well ahead of time. If you have that mental strength to just keep going, you'll make it. And even if some Frankensteinian monstrosity is what results, you can edit the ever-living fluff nuts out of it. When it comes to your book's cover and promotional graphics, remember that a lot of artists have just finished up the Inktober challenge, so go on social media in times when you're not writing, of course, and poke around. A lot of fantastic folks charge a very reasonable rate to make something incredible. So just do a little bit of digging and we can all help each other. Celebrate each chapter and accomplishment as a way to keep going. No one will write your stories or your characters quite the way you will, so make sure to give yourself the right level of aftercare so that you can keep pushing yourself each new day. If you're looking for a more in-depth breakdown of how to build your narrative spine, my book, Narrative Engineering Volume 1, The Narrative Spine, is conveniently available on Amazon, and it's free if you have Kindle Unlimited, so woo! If you don't have Kindle Unlimited, that's cool too, it's only $3, so it's kind of like you're taking me out for coffee and I'm bringing you a 428-page book to take home with you. In there, I break down narrative spines for Harry Potter, Kingsman, Sabriel, there's a whole bunch of stuff on Westworld, and there's a link in the description if you're looking for that extra level of guidance. Plus, don't forget about that PDF for all of your plotting needs, and that's completely free no matter what. I'm actually going to be streaming Storm Boy throughout the month of November as I write it at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on weekdays, and then probably some variable times on weekends. So don't forget to follow me on Twitch, where I'm an affiliate, and right here on YouTube so that you don't miss out on any of the updates. It's going to be a challenge to bring Storm Boy to life right before your eyes, but I don't know about you, I'm ready for a challenge. So let's take on NaNoWriMo together. Shout out any questions that you have right here in the comments section or on Twitter @SparklesMG. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.